We're going to get started. Mikanakan Dotem, Kuchiching and Donji, Nananegune Beak Indigo, Susan Blight, Indigenous Cause, Shaganashi Winakazoyan, University of Toronto, Nandanoki. So hello, my name is Susan Blight. I am Snapping Turtle Clan from Kuchiching First Nation, and I work here at the University of Toronto as the Aboriginal Student Life Coordinator. At First Nations House every year we put on an annual week-long series of events that we call Indigenous Education Week, and this year it's running from the 22nd to the 26th. And if you're not familiar with that series of events, it's really meant to sort of highlight and showcase the contributions of Indigenous peoples to the Academy. So it's not just scholars that we bring in, but community leaders, organizers, artists, scholars, a variety of people. As I mentioned in my opening, I am Anishinaabe from Kuchiching First Nation, so I'm a visitor on this territory as well, and I do want to make sure that I acknowledge the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations whose sacred territory that we are standing on today. Toronto has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years, and I want to be sure to acknowledge that, as well as to acknowledge the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, the agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe Nation to share the land and the resources, which allows us all to be here today to listen to Arthur Manuel. So his talk today is called 150 Years of Canadian Colonization and Our Right to Self-Determination. And I'm just going to read a short bio of Arthur Manuel for you. Arthur Manuel is a First Nations political leader in Canada, the son of Marceline Paul of the Tanaka, and political leader George Manuel of the
Shikwapa.
I was going to have that wrong. Thank you very much, Miigwech. He grew up on the Neskinlith Reserve in the interior of British Columbia. He attended the 3 Indian residential schools, and he is the father of 5 children. Manuel attended but never completed law school in the late 1970s, and afterward returned to his community, where he was 4 times elected chief, 1995 to 2003, thank you very much, and 3 times elected chair of the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council from 1997 to 2003. During this period, he served as spokesperson of the Interior Alliance of BC Indigenous Nations, and he was at the forefront of the Indigenous Logging Initiative. He also co-chaired the Assembly of First Nations, Implementation Strategic Committee that was mandated to develop a national strategy to compel the federal government to respect the historic Supreme Court decision on Aboriginal title and rights. On the international stage, Manuel participated in the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues since its inception in 2002. He has served as chair of the Global Indigenous Caucus, and he is currently co-chair of the Forum's North American Caucus. He made submissions on human rights violations against Indigenous people by Canada to UN human rights bodies, including under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and he was an active participant in the Convention on Biodiversity Conferences of the Parties in The Hague, Kuala Lumpur, Brazil, Bonn, Germany, and Nagoya, Japan in 2010. And we're very honored to welcome Arthur Manuel, and I did want to let you know that I spoke with Lee Miracle today, and she also says hello. Miigwech, come on. Welcome everybody, Arthur Manuel.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose territory I have the opportunity to be today here in Toronto. I'd also like to thank Ernie Sandy for the prayer this morning. For this, I think it's important that we do open our meetings with a prayer because of its connection to our land, to our territory. I'd also like to thank the House of Learning, the University of Toronto, for inviting me here today. And I think one of the things I just want to kind of clarify to you in my mind is when I talk about colonization, it's one of those topics that you want to know what level you want to engage with people about colonization, especially here in Canada. You know, people globally know what colonization is when you talk about Asia, or you talk about Africa, or you talk about the Orient, or you talk about Central South America. You sort of get an idea of what colonization really means. But here in Canada, you don't have that same kind of impression of what colonization really means. You know, Indigenous people need to understand that before Britain came, we had our own territories and our own areas, and we survived, I would say, fairly healthily. You know, when a lot of our people still can survive in the interior on hunting and fishing and a mixed economy with social assistance, which is a difficult life, but there is abundance there in terms of salmon, in terms of deer meat, moose meat, elk meat, and berries and medicines and that kind of stuff. But so I think a long time ago, before the colonization, we were in much better position than we are now. You know, colonization is one of those things that Harper really didn't understand. You know, and he did say one time that
he was hoping nobody understood.
And one time he said that colonization didn't exist in this country, and that's totally wrong. But when I talk about colonization, you need to say, people ask, what does that really mean in the Canadian context? You know, we're definitely coming up on a period when we're going to be talking about it a lot more, like next year, which will be 150 years of colonization here in Canada. I have a friend, his name is Bill Chu. He's a bit of a support worker. He lives in Vancouver. He's from the Chinese community. And one time when I was talking about colonization, he told me, you know, the province was around trying to give us money to celebrate some colonial celebration BC was going through. And the older Chinese were saying, why would we want to accept money to celebrate colonization? Colonization is actually terrible, you know. So we threw it out of our country, you know. Now they want us to celebrate it exists. But that's what's going to be going on next year. Is Canada's already put a lot of money in celebration of colonization, and they're going to be out there trying to hire a lot of Indigenous people to show up with their headdresses and whatever, sing and dance and pretend that colonization was really beautiful. And I think we need to be pretty cognizant of that, because I think one of the things that we need to be clear about is what colonization really is. And I know this from personal experience in terms of how my grandmother lived and my father lived and how I lived, and looking forward towards and how my children are going to live here in this country. You know, the real point of colonization is to dispossess Indigenous people of their territory. That is the number one purpose. That's generally the purpose of colonization around the world, is to dispossess the so-called native or the local people of their land, so that the colonizer can establish themselves. In countries like in Africa, the European colonizers were basically thrown out of the country and they took over. In the case of Canada, it became a settler state and it actually still continues to occupy our territory. And that's what we're trying to contend, is how does a settler state, interact with indigenous people. And we've been to the Supreme Court a whole host of times on indigenous proprietary interests vis-a-vis Crown property interests. We've had Aboriginal title in that. One is one of the most important issues. But one of the things is that you need to understand, after dispossession, what you do is you create dependency on the part of the people who you stole the land from. And that's what happens. That's the second element of dependency. And what happens when you create dependency like that, you also create the urge for the group to fight to regain their independence and be free. Therefore, colonization then involves oppression. That's the RCMP, it's the Army, it's the injunctions, the enforcement orders. All of those things are all set up under the issue of oppression. And I think you also need to understand that the United Nations has condemned colonization globally in all its manifestations because it's against world peace. And I'll get around to why it's against world peace in a while, but that's how come they condemn it. And the place that I see colonization still happening is in Canada, the United States, New Zealand, and Australia, the 4 British Commonwealth countries, as being the last place on earth where colonization is run like a race manufacturing place. And a lot of people don't even understand how that dispossession happens. A lot of people don't understand how the dependency happens, and a lot of people don't understand even how the oppression happens. But it all happens here in Canada. And it starts with the Constitution. The first Constitution of Canada was the British North America Act of 1867. That's 149 years ago. Under that, it was a British Act of Parliament that became Canada's first constitution. The thing what it did in the British North America Act is that it basically allocated all lands and resources within the boundary of Canada between the federal government and the provinces. That's our land. That's the legitimate instrument that the British used to steal our land. And it still is the foundation of this country, with the exception that they added Section 35, which somewhat cuts back on that, but we can talk about that later. But this is the colonial constitutional foundation for the Canada, and they say, well, this is British law. Before you never had law, now you got law, That's this is the foundation of British law. And that's how they divide up all our land in terms of fisheries under the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, so that they can pick, how to conserve. They pick how they can allocate the benefits for salmon, for cod. Well, they killed all the cod, but anyways, they used to be able to say about cod. You know what I mean? And then if you talk about the provincial government in terms of hunting, and you talk about the provincial government in terms of the Mineral Act, the Forestry Act, all the different pieces of legislation, it's under this framework and the list of powers that the federal and provincial government have divided up all the land. And that's what you need to understand, is we have no power over our land. That's all that you need to understand. Even under our Indian reserves are actually owned by the federal government under that section 9124. That's where the Indian Act is, and that's where our Indian reserves are. And we as individuals are the responsibility of the federal government. We as Indian reserves are under the responsibility of the federal government. So we literally, in North America, in Canada, really, if you boil it right down, to own no land, period. And we don't even have the right to identify who we are as citizens within the global theater. There's nothing there for us at all. You know, it's like the look at things like this, where you're talking about the Indian reserves. When you add up all the Indian reserves, and that is from Department of Indian Affairs, we have 0.2% of all of Canada. That's when you add up all of them. Every last one of them. We have 0.2% of all the land. And Canada has 99.8%. That's Canada and the provinces. That's how come we're poor. You know, I used to be a 0.2 Indian chief. 0.2, that means I had 0.2% of my territory, basically, to take care of my people. And you can't do it. You're put in an impossible, total impossible situation. Like Perry Bellegarde, he's a 0.2 Indian chief. You know, he's our national chief, but all of those chiefs, when they sit down, the actual land that they have to really make decisions over is 0.2. That's how come they always need to go over and kiss the ring of the Minister of Indian Affairs to get money. You know, we get critical of them, but the thing is that they're playing into an impossible hand to begin with. That whole theater is just total comedy, you know. And this is what I mean. A lot of Canadians, they just don't understand that. They say, oh, that Indian Reserve is a bottomless pit. We send it $8 billion every year to it. Well, it's a bottomless pit because all they have is 0.2 of the land to work on. You got 99.8%. Of course you need to give the people with 0.2 the money, because they can't take care of their health care, they can't take care of their education, they can't take care of unemployment, they can't take care of health care. All these things they can't take care of at 0.2. You know? I'd like to see it switch. I'd like to see the non-natives all of a sudden live on 0.2% of the land and 0.2 of this, and see how well you could do. The fact that we've even survived is a testimony of our fortitude as people to survive as Indigenous people, to survive as Indigenous people. Because you can turn around as a native, as an Indigenous person, and renounce all of your values and all of your principles, burn up your status card, and become an ordinary settler Canadian and fit into the 99.8, but then you won't be Indigenous anymore. You can do that. And that's what the government really wants us to do, is to do that and give up our values and join the 99.8%. You know, that's what the federal government's Department of Indian Affairs has been working on for the last 149 years, is to terminate and to assimilate us into the Canadian mainstream society. And we refuse to do that, because we have a right as indigenous people here to continue to be Indigenous people, because this is our homeland. We can't go back to London, England, because we're not British. We can't go back to France because we're not French. And we can't go back to Asia because we're not Asians. We can't go back to Africa because we're not Africans. The only place we have home is here. And we're entitled to be here. No and ifs and buts about that. But the whole colonial racist system makes it literally impossible for us to be actually ourselves at our own homeland, because they put us on 0.2% of the land and they say survive. If you want to be native, go there and survive. And that's totally wrong. And it shows up, you know, this whole thing about the United Nations Human Development Index, where definitely at one point in time Canada ranked #1. And on reserve Indians registered at a rank of 78. That's got to do with 0.2. People at 99.8 can rank #1 in the world. People with 0.2 have to rank 78. And that's brutal. When you talk about our children who go to the public school and they live on the reserve, they have to get on a school bus in level 78 community and ride to a level 1 community, go to school, be taught by the people who actually made their community dependent, learn their identity about who they are, and then in the after school jump back on a school bus and drive back to a level 78 community. You know, I've seen this expression about a quote from Mahatma Gandhi that said that violence is a pretty violent, I mean, poverty is a very violent experience or lifestyle. I just say, when you're talking about state governments, the use of systemic impoverishment has to be one of the most vicious human rights weapon you can ever use against people. Systemic impoverishment. Because I'm not talking about impoverishment that you sort of get because you don't have a job today, and maybe day after tomorrow you'll get a job and you'll get out of poverty. No, I'm talking about putting people on 0.2% of their land, generation after generation after generation, and seeing the poverty continue generation after generation after generation, and see the lack of hope, the hopelessness of young people who can't really see any real productivity in their life. You know, that's what happens when you live at 78 in a #1 country. Generation after generation after generation. And this is all written up in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report about how systemic that Department of Indian Affairs, that federal government, extinguishment, termination, assimilate the native strategy really is, and how it has failed time and time again to get any traction in our community. And we've refused it. We would rather put up with the poverty than to just generally just go and become carbon copies of our settler state government colonist type people. And we've stood up to that time and time again. They've tried all kinds of programs, all kinds of things to totally assimilate us. The Indian residential school system was one of them. And then they literally had to apologize to us and give us money for putting us in those institutions. But there's tons of programs like that where billions and billions, actually that $6 to $8 billion, a lot of that stuff is designed to try to suck you in down that system, programs and services. But the thing is that we need to be pretty clear about that, and we've fought back. We've always tried to increase our land interest in our own territory. Well, in Canada, there's only 2 ways you can deal with your land issue. One is to negotiate under the Federal Comprehensive Land Claims Policy, which ultimately results in you terminating your title into the land. And that's happened to the Nisga'a, that's happened to the James Bay Cree of Quebec, the Nisga'a, all the different treaties have done that, the modern ones, Tsawwassen, Manuel, and all of them have all done the termination. My people in the south central interior are totally divided by that. The 17 of the Secwepemc, there's 17 Secwepemc bands. The majority of us aren't negotiating, but 4 bands have did negotiate for the last 20 years. And they have they call it an NSTQ treaty. Probably you can see it on the internet. There's a big fight going on in our own community over it. Because most of us, we don't want them to go ahead, but Canada is still pushing this treaty on our people. And the other thing is you can go to court, but the court is very expensive, and it's not a really guarantee that you're going to get your land back, because literally over the last 149 years, the Supreme Court of Canada has only given back the land in the Chilcotin case. I think it's 1,900 square kilometers. That took them 149 years. You know, it's going to take the court a hell of a lot longer to get it on the ground, because despite the fact that the court recognized Aboriginal title back in '73 in the Calder case, it was really iffy when the Chilcotin case was happening, whether or not they were going to give any land back at all. And even then, they only give back a very small portion of the land. So the courts are pretty inadequate as a remedy for Indigenous people, you know, to be able to get land back. But nevertheless, it does establish, in the court system, it does establish that we do have legal rights to our land. Delgamuukw, Haida, and Chilcotin, those 3 cases more recently sort of recognize that we do have Aboriginal title in our territory to our land. And it gives foundation for us to be able to move forward on at the international level without having a lot of problems, having to double argue with Canada. But really, what does the Section 35 and what does the court cases really mean on the ground? And one of the things is that we know is that the government's trying to squeeze us actually to mean nothing on the ground in terms of colonization. And I've studied all of the agreement and principles that the federal government has negotiated with Indian bands in British Columbia, because I'm talking mostly a lot from British Columbia's point of view, because I'm from British Columbia, and British Columbia is one of the largest areas in North America where we don't have treaties, and we are in negotiating on our land rights issues right now. And I've examined these treaties, and this is part of a study report that I wrote for the United Nations Special Rapporteur Rodolfo Staffenhagen way back in 2006, which just basically says that the purpose of these agreements that the government's signing with Indigenous people today is to extinguish our title. But one of the things you need to understand is that the government doesn't use the word extinguishment. And this is the level of weasel worrying and stupidity that goes on behind their policy. The last group to include "we hereby cede, surrender, release, and give up all our rights and title to our land to the federal government" were the James Bay Cree of Quebec in 1975. They did that. They signed off on it. Billy Diamond and all of them, they all signed off on that. But that report went to the United Nations, or that agreement went to the United Nations. And the United Nations said that Canada should not put extinguishment of land rights in any land settlement agreement of indigenous people. And what that did was it got the Department of Indian Affairs to sit down and get all the top-notch deputy ministers and ADMs and all the senior bureaucrats together in Ottawa. And their question was, how can we extinguish indigenous land rights without using the word extinguishment? That was their choice. And so what they came up is a modified rights model and a non-assertion model. And those are the present policies that they do. And that's what's in these treaties. The Nisga'a Agreement was the first of the modified rights model. And what it does is it basically, the modified rights model is contained in the federal comprehensive land claims policy today. And what it does is it says that the indigenous people who do have Aboriginal title to their land will modify their title to mean only what's contained within the agreement. Like if this was the agreement, they would say that my Aboriginal title would only be what's contained in this agreement and nothing else. If it's in this other document, it doesn't count. It's only if it's in this document that it counts. And then they totally limit what you can negotiate, because the first thing they preclude, they say, are things that affect the sort of national security, the national interest of Canada, which is everything's important, economics, and all. Only we as Parliament can deal with that, and we can't put any of that into the agreement. So title land becomes totally ineffective in that sense. And the second kind, they say we can negotiate these things and put them in the agreement, but they actually don't just affect you, they affect other people, but in certain circumstances we'll allow you to do certain things with our acquiescence and our agreement on those things. And they use things like marriages and this kind of stuff that you can actually do them yourself, but you still need the province to overlook you or something like that, that kind of stuff. And then the third kind of stuff that they say they will negotiate are things that just affect you and your Indian reserve or you and your settlement lands. You can just that's where the agreement, so both of those agreements are just very narrowly contained within the confines of the settlement lands themselves and not the territory. And that's how come we as Secwepemc will not negotiate under this method, because it does, according to the UN, de facto extinguish your title, even though it doesn't use the word extinguishment. It uses the words modified rights model in that. But anyways, in BC, this is generally what you have, is a whole whack of different groups that have decided, in frustration, I think many of them, to actually negotiate with the under the BC Comprehensive Land Claims Policy. And so that's generally what we have to look forward in Canada, is either go to court or negotiate. In our case, we have basically pulled away from all of those two areas. And I've spent a considerable amount of time going to Geneva, Switzerland, and to New York City to seek some hearings about our rights, because if you can't get justice in Canada, you have to get justice outside Canada. And as far as I'm concerned, why call yourself a First Nation if all you're going to do is stay home in Canada? You should get out in the world community, meet the world, and start talking about who you are as an Indigenous group. But there is a system there that's been established after the Second World War. And millions of people were killed in the Second World War. And the state governments said, let us not do that again. Let us set up the mechanisms to be able to remedy some of these problems that we have. And these are the problems that I'm talking about in this room. because this is part of the situation about comp claims and about land rights. But one of the things is they've set up all these different human rights treaty bodies along this side here. And we're concerned about the United Nations Human Rights Committee. The United Nations Human Rights Committee is set up that way. And basically, it's in charge of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That's a treaty that Canada signed. And basically Canada is saying they're going to implement that treaty domestically. And with regard to Indigenous people, they've been a total failure. And that's what we're talking about, you know, is changing that. The other one is the Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That's that second one. And the other one is the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Those top three committees and top three covenants are the ones that impact Indigenous people here in Canada. They're committees that have already many recommendations that they have made to Canada, that Canada has totally ignored, with the exception really of one, that they haven't. But you can see how that set up. Those are just the names of the different ones. But anyways, the whole process here in terms of international human rights is that Canada has signed on those treaties and are supposedly, according to the top, to ratify those, okay? And they're supposed to reform Canada's laws to comply with those international covenants, okay? And then they're supposed to inform all of us about what their responsibilities are in relationship to those things. And then they're supposed to do is to ensure the laws are implemented inside Canada, set up an independent court system, which the Supreme Court is supposed to be, have good governance. And if we have a complaint like extinguishment, for instance, we should be able to go to the Supreme Court and tell them that the comprehensive land claims policy is going to extinguish our land rights under the modified rights model, and we should be able to settle it domestically. But our courts aren't set up their way. So even though Canada says, oh yeah, we got peacekeepers, we send them abroad, we're great human rights defenders, they don't have the mechanism of implementing human rights in this country, because they don't even implement the recommendations that the United Nations Human Rights Committee have told Canada they should be implementing on the ground. And I think that's the real awareness that Canadians have to be made aware of. Like literally the United Nations has told Canada is don't keep those native people, Indigenous people living on that 0.2% of the land. That's wrong. Because all the poverty that goes along with that is wrong. You should not be doing that. It's extremely racist for you to keep those people on that, on their own homeland in those places. That's what they're saying in those decisions and recommendations. But the cabinet, the prime minister, and the premiers don't listen, nor does the chief justice listen. They rather say, okay, we're doing all we can with these people. It's really their fault. They're just a bunch of dumb Indians. We give them free education, and they don't do nothing with it. You know, we give them free houses. They just wreck them. They just need rep programs to fix them up, you know, all this kind of garbage, you know. And it just becomes a vicious fight at that level because they want to keep us on the 0.2% land base. See, a lot of that stuff's supposed to flow through this. This is actually just taken off the United Nations chart. I didn't make it up. That's from their stuff. And that's what Canada's supposed to be doing, is reading this chart too and figuring it out and applying it. And it's not that complicated, you know. I'm not a brain surgeon that way, you know. So the thing is that it's one of the things that, you know, we need to be looking at as things. You know, one of the things is that I need to say, I don't know if you know this, but under oppression, one of the things that happened in BC way back in 1995 is that we had this standoff at Gustafson Lake with Wolverine and the defenders up there, and they had a big shootout with the RCMP. Lucky nobody was killed. They shot about 70,000 rounds at Wolverine and his people. It was from my people. All they had was 12 hunting rifles in the camp. They had 2 AKs, one that didn't work and one that did work. But they weren't in it for shooting with the cops. They were just there originally living there because it was their Sundance grounds, and that's why they were there. They wind up in a shootout with the RCMP. In the end, they gave up, and the RCMP arrested them, and Jones did 9.5 years in penitentiary. But the more important thing is that this other guy that was arrested was James Petawanakwat from Ontario. He was arrested. And he was arrested. And when he was out on parole, he violated his parole by going to the United States. And he went down to the United States, and then when he was caught by the United States police, he went to court and he pleaded, he sought political refugee status in the United States. And he went before the Oregon District Court in Portland. And when he was there, the court said it seems totally ludicrous that we would be considering giving this Indigenous person from Canada political refugee status because their policies are just like American policies. How can it really be that these people would even qualify for refugee status? You know, but we have to look behind why he was arrested and why he was given parole and look at the actual substantive case. And when district court did that, and they seen the shootout, they seen the fight, the lack of political response from the Canadian government, they gave James Petawanakwat political asylum. He's still living in the United States. You know, like he's a refugee. When I hear about refugees in Canada, I say most Canadians probably don't know that there's an Indigenous refugee from Canada living in the United States. You know, because one of the things is Wolverine is asking for a public inquiry into the Gustafson Lake matter, and I said, yeah, that's true, because James Petawanakwat is still a political refugee. The political nature of the fight is still happening here in this country, that even their neighboring country, the United States, when they examine situations in Canada, when it comes down to push comes to shove, actually will grant a Canadian Indigenous person political asylum. And so that Canada can't go down there and arrest him. But he does want to come back to see his people. He said he's got a lot of relatives that have passed on. He wants to come home. And that Canadians should be seeking to get him amnesty so he can come back to Canada. And, you know, he's getting to be an older guy like myself. And he wants to pass away in his own home territory. And people should get him back. And that's something that Trudeau should do. If he wants to talk about reconciliation, he wants to talk about dealing with Indigenous rights, is that they should let James Petawanakwat home again. You know, because he's done enough time in the United States. Like, we used to punish people by banishing him, and somehow he got himself self-banished from his own territory. We should let him back home to to be with these people again, because he did spend a number of years in jail, and he's been banished since then, and now we should let him home again. You know, nobody got killed. Jones did his time. Everybody's been there, and he did his time. So I think when we talk about these things, about reconciliation, about doing different things, we need to think about some of the real problems, you know. I don't mind our land being opened up to refugees from Syria and other places, but we also need to take care of our own refugees, especially James Petawanakwat, who should be here in his own territory. Anyway, so I'd just like to say that. And, you know, I'm not really barking up the wrong tree when I'm talking about the United Nations Human Rights Committee, because some people sort of say that's a little far-fetched, Art, you know, to expect the UN to really have any benefit. But you have to think about the whole issue of Laval and of Sandra Lovelace. You know, these two cases affected every Indigenous family, every Indigenous reserve across this country, and that involved when Indigenous women used to marry non-Indigenous or non-status Indigenous men. They lost their status, and the Supreme Court of Canada in Laval basically said that was not discrimination against women, and that basically endorsed it. And Sandra Lovelace, a few years later, wound up going before the same committee, one of these same committees I'm talking about, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and actually they said to Canada that they're violating her rights as an Indigenous woman by taking her status away. And it resulted in Bill C-31 in 1985 being passed, and all of those women being reintroduced into their community along with their children, and you know, every reserve in the country was affected. Most families were affected by that kind of thing. But that just shows you when Canada wants to, and it has the political will to, they can actually implement these international treaties when they want to. So you need to really ask yourself, like, why do they not do it when it comes to Indigenous proprietary interests? I think you all kind of know why. But anyways, this is the number one provision that I think Indigenous people need to be cognizant and aware of, and it says that all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So that's Article 1 in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It's also the number one covenant on the international economic, social, cultural rights. They're basically those two treaties, international human rights treaties, are known as the self-determination treaties, because they both start off with identically the same wording. And actually Article 3 in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People actually says that Indigenous people are entitled to self-determination, and it spins off some of the same wording as here. But the difference between the Declaration and the treaty is that this is actual international law. The Declaration is not international. It says what should be. But you need to understand that the United Nations Human Rights Committee says that this right actually belongs to Indigenous people here in Canada. That's what you need to know. And that's Article 2 of the whole of that provision 2. Paragraph 2, I should say. And it says, all peoples may for their own ends freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice to any obligations arising out of the international economic cooperation based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. And when you apply this principle to this article to how Indigenous people are treated, especially when you go back to the 0.2 framework, it's not being dealt with fairly in here. In fact, you'll see where the UN says that pretty pointedly. One of the things that I do, and I'm going to be doing that with regard to the treaty process again, is I do write early warning and urgent action complaints to the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And I'm going to be writing one up in relationship to Canada not following the United Nations recommendations as an agenda. And I think it's going to be directed to Trudeau, because Trudeau was just in Ottawa with Ban Ki-moon saying he's going to work with the UN and he's going to do this and do that. I know a number of chiefs have already asked him for meetings to reconsider and rethink this, and he hasn't responded to any of them yet. But one of the things is that what we need to do is go to the Geneva, and they're going to be meeting the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the committee that's responsible for early warning and urgent action. It's going to be meeting in April 25th to May 13th, and we can make a complaint about Canada in terms of them not putting this at the top of the burner, or in terms of the UN recommendations as being the agenda. Because right now the agenda on land claims is set by the Department of Indian Affairs, and it's always been extinguishment, it's always been termination, and all those kinds of things, so we'd be using that mechanism. Anyways, I just put that in just to show you that these are the people that in this, the last time I was there in 2009, Bertha Williams, Dexter Qua from the Little Dene, Darrell Bob from the Hacklet Indian Band and the Squaquaw Protection Center were the different groups that I complained with. This time around, I'm going to have a whole different other group of nations, like the Sewapmuk on the NST2 treaty, and possibly some others from across Canada. But anyways, this is what you get back from them, is you get a letter, and they will write out in the letter to Canada about which they find against Canada, and they ask them for information or do whatever you ask them to as a remedy, and they measure one way or the other. And in this case, one of the things that we did get was a letter that talked about the treaties and the use of money for influencing the decision on the votes and this kind of stuff, and they question Canada about it. Canada's still doing that, though, you know. And the thing is that if more Native people need to get more upset, Canadians need to get upset, and they need to really insist that Canada change their policy according to the recommendations that the United Nations Human Rights Committee makes to them. You know, that's one of the things. And this is just an answer that Canada gave on this one thing about, I don't know if you know this, one of the ways Canada influences decisions on land claims is that they lend the native band money to negotiate with them on the treaty, and then they get really deeply involved. This one band, Hacklet, they were asking a payment of $27,000 a month to repay, and they could have never paid it. Had they agreed, this thing would have skyrocketed through the moon. But anyways, they say that in their letter, this is directly quoted from the Canada restates that Canada has written to the Hacklet First Nation to state that the obligation to repay the loan, which was $27,000 up to $16 million something, has been placed in abeyance, and this loan repayment is not being sought by Canada. And the reason we had to ask them again for, because this was about the second time we asked them about this loan, is that they wouldn't send the band a letter. And if any of you are accountants or something like that, you know that the band has to get a letter from the people they borrowed the money from saying to them that they won't collect the money. And the Department of Indian Affairs wouldn't send that to the band because they didn't want the band to have a letter from them saying they didn't have to pay the loan back, because they used the loan to squeeze the other bands. So they didn't want, and they keep on saying that. So the band literally had to take the report from the UN, show that to their auditor, who felt that it was satisfactory that they're telling the United Nations they didn't have to repay, so they took the loan out. And you know where their audit goes anyways? It goes to the Department of Indian Affairs, the people who are trying to collect the loan. And if the Department of Indian Affairs wanted them to put the loan back in, they would have told them to put back the loan, but the loan disappeared and they just ignored it. so it's off their accounts payable list. So they don't have to pay, but that's how come that's in there like that. But you need to understand that some of this stuff takes a long time to get done. Like this thing about self-determination, just basically saying that Canada has sort of acknowledged self-determination in April 7th, 1999. And this is the part that I really want to get to, the last red thing. It says the committee also recommends that the practice of extinguishing inherent Aboriginal rights be abandoned as incompatible with Article 1 of the Covenant, okay? That's the part, if you're an Indigenous human rights fighter, remember that part, because that's the part which protects your land rights as Indigenous people. And they also talk to Canada that they should be dealing with this comp claims thing. It says the state party should re-examine its policy and practices. That's what you call the modified rights model, non-assertion model. It should be taken to ensure that they do not result in extinguishment of inherent Aboriginal rights. So they've been told that time and time again by different Indigenous people. The other one I just want to quickly raise, because I know people get concerned, especially Indigenous people, is about the real trump card Canada has is that you need to recognize Canada's territorial integrity of all of Canada, okay? And that any group inside Canada cannot just dismember the country because of certain rights. And these questions were raised in the Quebec Quebec reference that they put before the Supreme Court when they had their last referendum. Chrétien did that, and all these different things. And they said that nothing can be used to dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or the political unity of the, what we call here the settler sovereign state or independent nation. And I want to say that Native people have really never ever said that. You know, we basically said that we wanted the government to recognize our rights. And the Supreme Court have actually recognized our rights. It's the government that hasn't recognized our rights. The United Nations recognizes we have rights and actually tell Canada you can't even extinguish their rights. You're not supposed to extinguish their rights in any settlement. I argue that we're not trying to dismember the country. We're trying to tell the country that if Canada has any territorial integrity, it has to be based on Aboriginal and treaty rights. We're the foundation of Canada's territorial integrity. The Supreme Court has got it totally wrong, because the Supreme Court of Canada says that way back in 1846, this is in BC, when Britain asserted its sovereignty over British Columbia, what happened was that it created Aboriginal title, and Aboriginal title is a burden on Crown title. And I don't believe we're a burden on Crown title, because if Britain, when it asserted its sovereignty over our land, if it was the underlying title, it would have extinguished our land title. It would have extinguished it. You know what I mean? and it never extinguished it. Therefore, I argue that the underlying title has to be Aboriginal, and it has to be treaty land title is the underlying title. And if there is a burden on our Aboriginal and treaty title, then it is the Crown's title that's a burden on us. So it's actually the opposite. It's actually the other way around. And that's what really happens in Canadian legal cases is they're always arguing that colonial doctrines type discovery issue. And they always get it backwards because they're trying to find a reason why settlers should still be in control or still part of the Canadian political system. And they're trying to find that reason, and I say that if non-native Canadians, non-Indigenous Canadians have a right here, it's not because of the colonial doctrines of discovery, because those are wrong, because they're racist. They say that settler property rights are superior to Indigenous people's property rights simply because settlers are white and Indigenous people are brown. It goes back to that period in our history when that was acceptable, but it's no longer acceptable. If settlers have a right to be here in Canada, it's the same right that we have too, and that is you have a human right to be here. You know, that's the foundation, that it has to be there. Just like we have a human right to be here, we have a right to self-determination in our territory, and we have a right to be self-sustaining as Indigenous people. And the thing is that I think settlers need to realize that though you have a right to be here, it doesn't give you also the right to totally exploit the land at your free will, whatever way you want. It doesn't give you the right to put in the Alberta tar sands. It doesn't give you a right to put in dams that flood out our communities and other things. And we have to sit down. When we talk about reconciliation, those are the factors that have to go into the reconciliation. If we have a human right to be here, you need to respect that we can expand our communities so that we can be self-sufficient. Take a look at the United States. Take a look at the Navajo Reserve. Take a look at the Yakima Reserve. Take a look at the other reserve of the, I forget what name it is, but yeah, there's some fairly large Indian reserves down in the United States. It doesn't mean that these guys take the reserve to the moon. Those reserves are still part of the United States economy. They're still part of the Washington state economy. They're just earning a livelihood for Indigenous people in those areas. And I think it's really important for Canadians to recognize that that's what we're talking about. You know, for instance, you need to understand that Canada is the second largest country in the world. You need to realize that we have a population of 35 million. Most of them live here in Toronto, but we got a population of 35 million people. And you can't find a solution to the land question. You know, we don't have 3 billion people in Canada. You know, we got 35 million. There's more people in California. There's 38 million in California. You know? And the BC, for instance, BC is as large as California, Oregon, and Washington combined. You know? And like I tell you, California is 38 million. BC's population is what?
3.5?
No, 4.5. 200,000 are us. You know, you can lose the population of BC in Los Angeles, you know? So the thing is that, you know, and we can't find a solution. It really makes Canadians look extremely greedy, you know? When you sort of say, no, keep them on 0.2, you know, and you need to change that. Trudeau says he wants to talk about reconciliation. Reconciliation must be based upon an agenda set out in the United Nations, human rights recommendations with regard to Indigenous people here in Canada. And one of the blueprints of that has already been written. It's been written under the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples Report. The United Nations has asked Canada time and time again about implementing it, because in the United Nations RCAP admits that the first problem in Canada, human rights problem, is Indigenous people. And the first thing that needs to be dealt with is the land issue, you know, before you even deal with self-government. So there's actually proof of these things set out. But anyways, I've spoken to one.
You have? Yeah.
Okay.